Long ago, before the maps were drawn, before the kingdoms had names for what they feared, there was a woman. She was born at the edge of the great river, in the hour before the world woke up. Her people called her Aret. It meant favor. It also meant the thing that returns. She would prove them right, on both counts. In a time when kingdoms rose and fell like tides, when warlords carved continents with iron and blood, when a woman's power was supposed to end at the door they assigned her, she walked through every wall. She crossed oceans that had no name for her. She learned the languages of her enemies before she ever met them. She walked into wars, not with a sword, but with something sharper, her mind. And they never saw her coming. She loved deeply. She lost completely. She built something out of two worlds and the space between them that no war could ever fully burn down. I am Aret of Calabar. I have crossed the sea you fear. I have stood in the fire you built, and I am still here. Aret of Calabar, an Afro Korean epic, begins now.
She came to the world at the edge of the great estuary, in the hour when the harmattan had ceased its dry breath and the mangroves stood in the morning fog like sentinels who have forgotten what they guard. Her mother, a highborn daughter of the Efik trading house, said nothing remarkable attended the birth, no thunder, no strange light upon the river, no speaking bird in the rafters. Only the child herself, wet and black and ferociously quiet in a way that was not the quiet of weakness, but the quiet of attention, as though she had arrived already listening. Her name was Aret. It meant favor in the tongue of her people. It also meant, in the older dialect, the thing that returns. Her grandmother, who had traveled the salt roads as far as the interior before settling into the comfortable authority of old age, said both meanings were true and neither was sufficient. The child looked at you and you felt it, the particular sensation of being known by something that did not yet have the words for what it understood. Calabar in those years was a city of waterways and negotiations. The great mangrove delta breathed with the tide and exhaled commerce, palm oil and dried fish and woven cloth moving outward on the creeks, cloth and copper and salt moving inward. The whole machinery of exchange run by the Efik trading houses whose politics were as intricate as the root systems beneath the water. Aret grew up inside that intricacy. Her father sat on the council. Her uncles commanded canoes. Her mother understood, before Aret herself did, that the girl was not destined for an ordinary life within that world. She was destined to rewrite its borders. She learned to read before any of her brothers. She learned the trade tongue used with the northern merchants before she learned to cook. She could listen to two men argue across a fire and tell you, before the argument ended, which one would yield and which one would carry the resentment home. She was not cruel about this knowledge. She was simply efficient, the way a river is efficient. It does not explain why it takes the path it takes. It simply takes it. By the time she was 17, she had negotiated, through her father's house, the release of a trading dispute that had been calcifying into violence for 3 years. She did not storm the negotiating table. She attended 2 dinners, listened carefully, said almost nothing, and then sent a message to each party through intermediaries so discreet that neither man understood how the resolution had arrived. Her father knew. He watched her with an expression she would come to recognize on powerful men, the mixture of admiration and unease that belongs to those who realize, too late, that they have taught something to someone who has surpassed them. She married at 19, as was expected. The man was decent, a younger son of a rival trading house, handsome enough, politically convenient. She was not unhappy. She simply understood, with the clarity that had always attended her interior life, that this was not the architecture of her actual existence. It was a room in a much larger house. She was still learning where all the doors were. The ships came from many directions in those years. Portuguese ships, Dutch ships, ships from the Arab coast whose triangular sails moved like the fins of great fish against the horizon. And occasionally, Making no sense to anyone who tried to account for the route they had taken, there came ships from further east, merchants and envoys and wanderers out of China and Japan and, once, a delegation from a kingdom on a long peninsula that the sailors called Goryeo, whose people wore white and spoke in a language that sounded like water moving over smooth stone. Aret was 22 when she first encountered that language. The delegation was small, a trade envoy and his retinue of 4, led by a lean man of middle age named Counselor Bach, who wore his authority so quietly you could mistake it for servility until you looked at his hands, which were a scholar's hands, and his eyes, which were a general's eyes. They had come, through an improbable chain of intermediaries and favorable winds, to establish a preliminary conversation about the viability of a trade route, a conversation no one in Calabar took seriously except Aret, who sat in on the initial reception as her husband's representative and spent the next hour listening with her whole body. She did not speak Hangul, but she watched Counselor Bach's face while the interpreter translated, and she understood something that the interpreter was failing to convey, that these men were not primarily interested in trade. They were interested in intelligence. They were mapping the political landscape of the Delta with the same methodical care they would use on a military survey, and they were doing it in the open, smiling politely, because they understood that people who feel underestimated rarely guard what they say. After the reception, she sent word to Counselor Bach through a servant. She asked if he would consent to a private meeting the following morning before the formal trade discussions resumed. She sent with the message a small gift, a carved ivory disc, unremarkable in itself, but carved in a geometric pattern that was, to anyone who knew the Efik notation system, a mathematical statement of equivalent exchange. I give this to you and I expect something of equal value in return. Counselor Bach sent back the disc, unaltered. He added a small piece of celadone ceramic in a shade of green. She had never seen a green like water in the shadows of a cave. The meaning was clear enough without any notation system. I understand the terms. Bring what you wish to trade. They met at dawn in a room at the edge of her father's compound, the air still cool, the river mist coming through the open window in slow, drifting fingers. He spoke through his interpreter. She spoke through hers. But within 20 minutes, they had dispensed with the interpreters entirely and were communicating through a combination of trade tongue fragments, hand gestures, sketches on a piece of bark cloth, and a silence that was more productive than most conversations she had experienced in her life. He told her, in this hybrid language they invented together in that hour, that the Goryeo kingdom was at war, not officially, not yet, but in the way that serious things are always happening before they are announced. There were factions in the court. There was a general who had grown larger than the king he served. There was a question of succession that was consuming the northern provinces. He told her this not as confession, but as assessment, the way a physician describes the body's condition to another physician. She told him about the Delta, about the way the trading houses were consolidating, about the political marriages being arranged between the great families and what she believed would happen when the older generation died and the inheritance disputes began. She told him about the Portuguese influence and how it was threading itself through the coastal politics in ways that most people did not yet understand, but that she had been tracing for 2 years. Counselor Bach looked at her for a long moment. He said something in Hangul that his interpreter, now reinstated and clearly uncomfortable, translated as, in my country, a woman who understood politics as you understand it would either be a queen or dead within the year. There is no middle ground. She asked which he thought she would be. He considered it seriously, which she appreciated. Then he said, I do not know your country well enough to say, but in mine, I would bet on the queen. She did not forget that conversation. It lodged in her like a splinter, not painful, but persistent, something you are aware of even when you are not thinking about it. She was a married woman with responsibilities and a position that was comfortable enough by any ordinary measure. She was also a woman who had just received the most accurate appraisal of her abilities she had ever been offered, from a stranger on the far edge of the world who had known her for less than 2 hours. Counselor Bach's delegation left after 9 days. The trade agreement they proposed never materialized. The intermediary chains were too long, the winds too unreliable, the political complications on both ends too intricate for a preliminary conversation to resolve. But he left her two things: a slim volume of documents written in Chinese characters, a history of the Korean peninsula rendered in the scholarly lingua franca of the eastern trade routes, and the name of a merchant in the northern city who could teach her Hangul if she was interested and patient enough to learn. She was both. It took her 4 years to acquire enough of the language to read the documents Bach had left her. She did not announce this project to anyone. She conducted it in the margins of her actual life, in the early mornings and the late hours, using a teacher she had arranged through a chain of contacts that could not easily be traced back to her. She had married a man who was not politically ambitious, which she had once considered a limitation and now understood was a freedom. He asked no difficult questions. He did not demand accounting of her hours. He was kind to her in the uncomplicated way of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted from a marriage and expects no complications. She was not unkind to him in return, but she was elsewhere a significant portion of the time, and they both understood this without ever saying so. When she was 26, her father died. The inheritance structure of the trading house broke open the way she had predicted it would, and for 2 years she was absorbed entirely in the politics of preservation, protecting her mother's position, protecting the younger children, keeping the disputes from consuming the whole structure. She was good at it. She was very good at it. The older men on the council, who had known her since she was a child listening in doorways, began to consult her openly, which was both an acknowledgement and a test. They were seeing whether she would accept consultation as a substitute for authority. She accepted it carefully for exactly as long as it was useful. She was building something, and buildings require patience. You do not announce the architecture before the foundation is poured. It was in this period that she first heard about the civil conflict in the Goryeo court with any specificity. Fragments arrived through the trade routes, a merchant from the northern coast who had come down the Arab shipping lines, a document in the Chinese scholarly tongue that was passed through 3 hands before reaching hers, a letter from Counselor Bach himself, who was still alive and still watching, whose message was oblique, but whose meaning was, to her trained reading, absolutely clear. Things in the peninsula were coming to a breaking point, and the General Bach had mentioned years ago was now the central fact of everyone's calculations. His name was being spoken in the court with the particular mixture of admiration and terror that attached to men who had become larger than the structures meant to contain them. His name was Hanul. She said the name aloud in her study, in the early morning, with the river mist at the window. It was a name that meant sky in the Korean tongue. She had spent enough years learning that language to know that names, in that culture, were not casual assignments. A man named Sky had been given that name by someone who expected him to be vast. She did not know, then, what was coming. She was a woman of 28 in a trading city on the West African coast, living inside a life that was functional and respected and almost entirely insufficient for who she actually was. She did not know that within 2 years she would be on the Eastern Peninsula, that she would stand in the presence of General Hanul and feel, for the first time in her life, the specific terror and exhilaration of meeting someone whose intelligence matched her own and whose ambition was, if anything, larger. She did not know any of this. But she was reading everything she could find about Goryeo, and she was taking careful notes, and she was, with the patient deliberation of someone who has understood from childhood that the world is not arranged for her convenience and must therefore be arranged by her own hands, preparing herself for a future that had not yet disclosed its full shape. That was enough. It had always been enough. She had been preparing since the morning of her birth, in the mangrove fog, with the river at the world's edge, and the entire question of what she would become lying open before her like a sea whose currents she had not yet learned but intended, absolutely, to master. The man who made it possible, who made the impossible passage between Calabar and the Korean peninsula something other than fantasy, was a half-Arab, half-Portuguese merchant captain named Ferreira dos Santos, who was widely considered untrustworthy and widely employed, the two qualities not being in contradiction in the trade world of that century. She had known him for 4 years. He owed her a significant debt from a matter she had resolved quietly, protecting him from a fraud accusation that would have ended his trading license and possibly his life. She had not called in that debt because she had been waiting for the moment when its value would be at its height. She called it in at the beginning of her 29th year. He did not argue. He understood the calculus. He looked at her across the table in his trading house, a dark, cluttered room that smelled of salt and pepper and old wood, and he said simply, "When?" She said, "The next monsoon season. I will need passage to the southern coast of the peninsula, and I will need papers that describe me as the representative of a Calabar trading consortium interested in establishing a formal route. The papers should be in the Chinese scholarly tongue, and they should be legitimate, not forgeries, but actual introductory documents from actual houses. I will give you the names." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You understand that the peninsula is at war?" She said, "I understand that." He said, "You understand that a black African woman arriving on the Korean coast during a civil conflict will be remarked upon?" She said, "That has always been true everywhere I go. It has never been an obstacle." He considered this. He said, "No, I don't suppose it has." She returned to her compound and sat in her study for a long time alone. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more precise than afraid. She was fully awake in the way that comes before the great decisions, when the ordinary life drops away and what remains is only the essential self, which is both very small and very clear. She thought of her mother. She thought of her husband, who would not understand what she was doing and whom she would not adequately explain it to because there was no adequate explanation that did not also reveal how long she had been living in two worlds simultaneously. She thought of Counselor Bach's voice, years ago, through the interpreter. "In my country, a woman who understood politics as you understand it would either be a queen or dead." She thought, "We will see which." Then she opened her notes on the Goryeo court and returned to studying. The southern coast of the Korean peninsula smelled of pine resin and cold seawater, and something she could not name at first, a mineral sharpness, like struck iron, that she later understood was simply the quality of the light, which was different here than anywhere she had been before. It came down from a sky that was, even in the warmth of late spring, a particular shade of blue that had no equivalent in the Delta palette, a blue that was slightly metallic, almost philosophical, as though the sky itself were a statement about the nature of distance. She arrived with 3 people. A young Efik woman named Vaughn who had served her family since childhood and who faced the entire extraordinary adventure of the journey with the equanimity of someone who has decided that one's mistress is simply more interesting than ordinary life. A young scholar from the Arab trading coast named Ibrahim who spoke 12 languages and whose job was to fill the gaps in her own linguistic preparation, and Counselor Bach's nephew, a narrow-faced young man named Bach. Juno, who had been sent to the coast to meet her and who looked at her that first morning on the dock, with an expression she recognized as the particular consternation of someone who has been told to expect something remarkable and is not entirely sure whether what has arrived qualifies. She let him look. She was accustomed to it. She was wearing Efik trade dress, wrapped cloth in the deep indigo that her family favored, her neck adorned with the particular combination of coral and brass that indicated status to anyone who knew how to read it, her posture communicating, without theatrical effort, that she was not in the habit of waiting for other people's assessments to complete before proceeding. After a moment, Bak Juno made the formal Korean bow of greeting and spoke in Hangul, and she answered him in Hangul, haltingly but comprehensibly, which produced in his face a second expression layered over the first, something that might, in another man, have become a smile. He led her inland. The country through which they traveled was extraordinary, mountains that appeared suddenly and without architectural logic, simply rising out of the land as though the earth had decided, at intervals, to stand up, rice paddies in the valleys between them, greener than anything she had seen in her life, green in a way that was almost violent, villages of clay tile and thatched roof that were beautiful in their austerity, in the way that things are beautiful when every unnecessary element has been removed. She observed everything. She asked questions carefully, letting Bak Juno explain the landscape and the political geography through which they moved, drawing him out with the skill she had spent a lifetime developing, the art of making people feel, while you extract from them every piece of information you need, that they are simply having a pleasant conversation. By the time they reached the town where they would spend the first night, she knew more about the structure of the Goryeo court than she had been able to piece together from all her reading, because Bok Juno, though cautious by nature, was young and somewhat flattered and not yet wise enough to realize how much he was telling her. The Civil War, though that was not yet the word anyone was using, was organized around two poles. On one side, King Gwanjong and his court, which was old, established, ceremonially powerful, and in the process of being outpaced by reality. On the other, a coalition of military commanders and eastern landowners who had grown tired of a court they considered corrupt and a tax system they considered predatory, and who had been organizing, with increasing formality, around the figure of General Hanol, not as a rebel, not formally, not yet, but in the way that power organizes around its actual center regardless of what the official map says. General Hanol was 38 years old and had been in the field, with almost no interruption, since he was 16. He had fought the northern border incursions, the Khitan raids, 3 separate internal suppressions that the court had preferred to handle quietly. He was, by the time Aret arrived on that coast, perhaps the finest military mind on the peninsula, a fact that the king's advisors acknowledged privately and denied publicly, because the math of the situation was becoming uncomfortable. The man most capable of defending Goryeo was the man most capable of taking it. She understood this before she met him. She understood it from the documents and from Bok Juno's careful non-answers to certain questions, and from the quality of anxiety she observed in the faces of the court officials who came to receive her delegation at the provincial capital. An anxiety that was not about her, specifically, but was ambient, a background condition of the political climate. She was walking into the exact center of a crisis that had not yet formally declared itself, and she was doing so deliberately, because she had determined, with the precision she brought to all calculations of this kind, that the center was where she needed to be. She met General Hanol on her 12th day in the country. He came to the formal reception not in military dress, but in the plain white clothing that Korean scholars and officials favored, which on him had the effect of theatrical understatement. The restraint of a man who knows he does not need the theater of armor to communicate what he is. He was not as tall as she had imagined, though he was tall for his country and time. He was lean in the way of men who have spent decades in the field and whose bodies have been disciplined into pure function. His face was the face of someone who has learned, through long practice, to show only what he chooses to show, which meant that when something crossed it uninvited, as happened in the first moment he saw her, some involuntary adjustment of attention, it was worth noting. He had been told she was a trade representative. He had been told she was formidable. He had not been told she was this, whatever this was. She saw him perform the rapid recalibration in real time, and she recognized it because she was performing a version of it herself, though she had better practice at concealing the performance. She bowed in the Korean manner she had studied. She greeted him in Hangul, more confident now, 3 weeks of daily immersion having smoothed some of the hesitations. She said, "I bring greetings from the trading houses of Calabar, and I bring also the respect of someone who has followed your career with considerable admiration from very far away." He looked at her for a moment, not with the unease that she sometimes saw in powerful men when a woman demonstrated that she had been paying attention to them, but with something more complicated. He said, "You speak my language." She said, imperfectly, "I ask your patience." He said, "My patience is extended. What did you study about my career?" She told him, briefly and precisely, 3 specific tactical decisions he had made in the northern campaigns that she had analyzed from the accounts available to her and considered exceptional, and 1 decision she thought had been a mistake, though a forgivable one given the conditions. She said the last part without softening it, because she had determined that this was a man who would find this softening condescending. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Which decision?" She told him. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, in a tone she could not entirely read, "The mistake was not the decision itself, but the intelligence I was acting on." "I knew this afterward." She said, "Yes." I suspected that from the account. But the account was incomplete. He looked at her again with that quality of attention that she would come to know very well over the months that followed, the full, almost uncomfortable focus of a mind that is rarely required to operate at its full capacity and has found, unexpectedly, something that requires it. He said, "What exactly is it that you want, representative of Calabar?" She said, "I want to know if what I have read about the political situation in this country is accurate. I want to understand what is coming. And I want to discuss whether there is a shape of cooperation that serves both our purposes." He said, "What purposes do you have in this country?" She said, "I have a trading house to protect. I also have a position in my own region that is contested by men who believe I do not belong there. I have learned that the most reliable protection for both is to be useful to people who are about to become very powerful before they become so." The silence that followed was the productive kind. He said, "You are direct." She said, "I find it saves time." What happened between them over the following months was not simple and resists simple description. There was, between them, from that first conversation, a recognition that had the quality of collision, two complex systems meeting and finding, in the friction, something generative. They were both people who had spent their lives in rooms where they were either underestimated or feared, and they had both developed, as a consequence, a particular kind of loneliness that is not about the absence of company, but about the absence of equivalence. To be known accurately is a rare gift. To find it in an unexpected place, in an unexpected form, is rarer still. They met formally at first, as diplomatic protocol required, with Ibrahim translating the more complex negotiations and Bak Juno present as a third authority. But the formal meetings were less important than what happened in the hours before and after them, the long conversations that had no official purpose, that wandered from military tactics to trade economics to the nature of power to the specific quality of the light on the eastern sea at the different times of year, which Hanul described with a poet's precision and which she listened to with her whole attention. He was a man of extraordinary internal life that he rarely displayed, because a general who displayed internal life was considered, in the culture of his time, to be demonstrating a kind of vulnerability. With her, he displayed it. She was, in part, safe precisely because she was foreign, outside the network of judgment in which he operated. But it was also more than that. It was simply that she understood what he said, and he knew she understood, and that understanding created between them a space that neither had quite experienced before. She understood, too, the political necessity of what was developing between them. She was not naive about this. She would not have been who she was if she had been capable of naivety about the intersection of the personal and the political. Hanul was not yet in a position to declare his authority openly. He needed, among other things, legitimacy, not merely military legitimacy, which he had abundantly, but the kind of symbolic legitimacy that came from alliances that transcended the existing factional lines. A woman from Calabar was, in this calculation, useful. She was outside the existing power map, which meant an association with her could not be read as alignment with any of the established internal factions. She knew he understood this. She knew he was making the calculation. She made it alongside him, openly, in the course of one of their conversations, laying out the logic as she would lay out any other strategic analysis, without sentiment, without concealment, with the clean efficiency of two professionals who respect each other enough to do business without pretense. And then she said, "I want you to understand that I know all of this is true, and I am also telling you that it is not the whole truth." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What is the rest?" She said, "The rest is that I find you genuinely interesting, which has happened to me very rarely in my life, and I would rather say so directly than have it become a complication later." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "In my country, what you have just said is either very brave or very reckless." She said, "In mine also." He said, "And yet you said it." She said, "I find recklessness and bravery are often the same action viewed from different distances." Something shifted in his face then, not the theatrical kinds of things that happened in stories, no sudden softening or brightening, but something more structural, as though a load-bearing wall had very slightly and irrevocably moved. He said, quietly, "Yes. I think they often are." The political situation clarified over the following 3 months with the grim inevitability of a thing that has been building for years and has finally run out of ways to be deferred. The king's court, sensing its own erosion, made the classic error of the threatened. It moved against Hanul not militarily but administratively, issuing directives that reduced his command authority and transferred 2 of his key regiments to generals who were less competent but more controllable. The eastern landowners who had been organizing around him interpreted this correctly as a declaration and accelerated their own preparations. Aret was in the provincial capital when the first real violence occurred, a tax enforcement mission from the court that had been intercepted by eastern militia and turned back with casualties. Not a battle. Not yet. But the kind of event that, once it has happened, cannot be unhappened, and everyone who hears about it knows, in the place below language, that they are now in a different kind of world than the one they were in before. She went to Hanul that evening. He was standing at the window of his planning room, looking north, and she knew from the quality of his stillness that he had been standing there for some time. She stood beside him, and they looked north together in silence for a while. She said, "It begins now." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then let us discuss what you need." He turned to look at her. He said, "You would help me in this." She said, "I have been helping you in this since the day I arrived. I helped you understand the implications of your financial situation. I helped you think through the secondary consequences of the Eastern Landowner Alliance. I am helping you now." He said, "If the court prevails, you will be implicated. You are a foreign national." She said, "The court will not prevail." He said, "You cannot know that." She said, "I can know it well enough to act on it," which is the only kind of knowing that matters in practical work. He was quiet again. Then he said something she had not expected, in a different register than his usual voice, lower, slower, stripped of the official precision he normally deployed. "I did not think, when I received the first letter about your visit, that I would be grateful you came. I was wrong." She said, "You thought I was a trade representative." He said, "I thought you were a complication." She said, "I am still that." He said, and there was in his voice something she had only heard there a handful of times, something that was neither strategic nor official. "Yes, but you are my complication," which is different. She did not answer him immediately. She was not a woman who reached for the easy response when the true one required more time. She stood at the window looking north, at the particular metallic blue of the evening sky above the mountains, and she thought about all the distances she had crossed to be in this room, and all the things she had calculated and all the things she had not been able to calculate, and all the ways in which the world was simultaneously exactly as she had known it would be and completely unlike anything she had imagined. She said, finally, "Then let us win." The campaign lasted 14 months. She was not a soldier and made no pretense of being one. What she did was more valuable to Hanul than another sword. She managed the political architecture of the rebellion while he managed its physical prosecution. She was the one who held the coalition of Eastern landowners together when their individual interests threatened to fracture it. She attended the meetings, listened to the grievances, found the formulations that allowed each party to feel that their concerns were primary without any of them realizing that she was simultaneously managing all of the others. She negotiated the supply agreements. She wrote the communications to foreign merchants and intermediaries that kept the trade routes functioning despite the conflict, which was the practical financial foundation without which even the finest army becomes ungovernable. And she was the one who, at a critical moment in the 8th month, prevented the defection of Lord Choi, the most important of Hanul's eastern allies, who had received a secret offer from the court and was wavering. She did not threaten him. She did not bribe him. She sat with him for 4 hours in a room at the edge of his estate, looked out over his rice fields with him, and talked to him about the difference between what he thought he wanted and what he actually needed, with such precise and compassionate understanding of his particular fears and aspirations that he came away from the conversation not merely recommitted but grateful. Hanul heard the account from Bok Juno. He said, reportedly, only, of course she did. They were not always in the same place during the campaign. Long separations were the rule rather than the exception. He was in the field and she was in the rear maintaining the infrastructure, and communication between them was conducted through letters that were primarily official and occasionally, in the final lines, something else. She kept those letters. She kept them because she was a person who understood that history would be made here and that the record of it mattered, and she kept them also for a reason she did not entirely acknowledge to herself, which was simpler and less organized than history. She simply wanted them. She discovered she was pregnant in the 11th month of the campaign. She told no one except Mfon, and she did not tell Hanol until the conflict was in its final phase, and the outcome was, by any serious calculation, already determined. When she told him, they were in a farmhouse in the eastern mountains, the first snow of the season coming down outside the window, the campaign almost over. He was still for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am well." He said, "And are you? How are you feeling about this?" She said, "I am feeling that it is a complication and also that I am glad." He said, "I am also glad. If you will permit me to say so." She said, "I permit you." He said, "What will you name him?" She said, "How do you know it is a him?" He said, and she would remember this for the rest of her life, the particular quality of certainty in his voice, the general who had learned to trust his assessments. "I know." "What will you name him?" She said, "Kanu Hanol." In my tongue, Kanu means the Great One. In yours, you know what Hanol means. He said, "Sky." She said, "Sky." Between the two, he will have room to grow. The silence between them was full, the particular fullness that comes not from the absence of words, but from the presence of everything that words are insufficient to carry. Outside, the snow continued. In the eastern mountains, the last of the court's military opposition was being processed into the new order that Hanol was building. In that farmhouse, something was also being built, not the campaign, which was ending, but something more intimate and more fragile. The private structure that exists between two people who have been through something together and arrived on the other side not unscathed but intact. It would not be easy. Nothing about their situation would ever be easy. She was a woman of Calabar in a country that had no framework for her presence except the one she had constructed herself. He was a man who was about to become one of the most powerful figures on the Korean peninsula, which meant that every relationship in his life was about to become a political calculation in someone else's accounting. Their son would be born into a gap between two worlds, which was its own kind of inheritance, not comfortable, but rich. She knew all of this. She had known it before the snow, before the campaign, before the farmhouse, before she ever set foot on this peninsula that smelled of pine and cold iron and the particular blue light of a sky she still had no name for in her own language. She had known it, and she had come anyway, with the exact quality of informed courage that she had brought to everything in her life, which was the courage not of ignorance, but of full understanding. The bravery that Hanol had recognized as being indistinguishable, at sufficient distance, from recklessness. She was not done yet. She had only just begun. 7 years passed between the end of the civil campaign and the beginning of the last war. 7 years in which the world she had helped make stabilized itself, grew complex in new ways, generated new inequities and new alliances, threw up new obstacles and opened new passages, and in which she lived. Though lived is perhaps too small a word for what she did in those years, which was closer to an ongoing and exhausting act of construction performed simultaneously on multiple levels: political, personal, maternal, diplomatic, strategic. Kanu Hanol was born in the second spring after the campaign's end, as she had known he would be: strong, watchful, inclined to silence in the way of certain children who are processing more than they reveal. He had her eyes, dark and deep and evaluating, and his father's stillness. He was, from his earliest months, remarkable in the specific way that she herself had been remarkable, which was not the remarkable of spectacular display, but the remarkable of sustained and uncommon attention. She watched him and felt, for the first time in her life, the particular vertigo of recognizing yourself in someone else. Hanol was, by that point, the effective power in the Eastern Territories and a figure of national consequence. The king who had moved against him was gone, abdicated under pressure, the official account said, which was the kind of official account that everyone understood and no one examined closely. The successor was younger, more pragmatic, and had reached, with Hanul's coalition, a working arrangement that was not peace exactly, but was stable enough to function as one. Hanul did not take the throne. He had never wanted the throne, a fact that confused the people who assumed all power-seeking was the same kind of seeking. What he wanted was the condition of the kingdom, its military security, its economic function, its capacity to endure. The throne was a symbol. He was interested in the substance. She understood this about him profoundly, and it was one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the deep structural ones, that what existed between them had the durability it had. They were alike in this. They had both spent their lives pursuing the substance of things rather than their symbols. And they recognized this in each other with the relief of travelers who have been walking the same road from different directions and have finally found where it meets. Her own position in those 7 years was extraordinary by any measure she could apply. She was technically still a trade representative, which was a fiction she maintained for pragmatic reasons. It gave her movement and access without the formal weight of a political title, which would have required official acknowledgement of things that were more useful left unacknowledged. In practice, she was the person through whom Hanul conducted the most delicate diplomatic work, the negotiations that could not be approached directly because the parties involved had too many reasons to refuse directness. She was good at it in the way that surgeons are good at surgery, not with visible effort, but with the fluency of someone for whom the work has become second nature. She also kept her connections to Calabar alive. Letters passed through the trade networks. She sent funds and intelligence home through channels that were her own, maintained independently of anything Hanul's apparatus provided. She was making sure, with the methodical care of someone who has learned not to burn the bridges behind them even when the road ahead seems clear, that she retained the capacity to return to the world she had come from. Not because she planned to leave, but because the freedom of knowing you can leave is entirely different from the freedom of staying. Lord Baeksean entered her life in the 6th year of that period, which was to say, he had always been at the edge of the political landscape she moved through, but he came into focus in the year when Hanul fell ill. The illness was not public. Hanul was not the kind of man who permitted his physical conditions to become political facts, and he managed the situation with the same control he brought to everything else, restricting the information. Continuing to appear at the functions that required his appearance, delegating with sufficient invisibility that the overall system did not register the strain. But she knew. She had known within days of the first symptoms, from the specific quality of the tiredness that came over him in the evenings, which was different from battle fatigue or strategic exhaustion. It was deeper than those things, more fundamental. An animal knowing that the body was negotiating with something that was not prepared to negotiate back. She told him what she observed. He confirmed it. They sat with that knowledge together in the way they had learned to sit with difficult things, without evasion, without the false comfort of optimistic projection. With the stark and clear-eyed intimacy of two people who have decided that honesty is the only form of respect that actually costs something. He said, "You should begin to think about what comes after." She said, "I am thinking about it. I am also not abandoning the possibility that you recover." He said, "Both things can be true simultaneously." She said, "Yes." He said, "Baeksean has been watching you for 2 years. He is not subtle about it, though he believes he is." She said, "I know." He said, "He is a capable man. He is the best of the Eastern coastal lords. He does not have my gifts, but he has steadiness, and he is not corruptible, which is rarer than gifts." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Are you recommending him to me?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I am thinking about what you will need, and what Kanu will need, and what the Eastern territories will need, and I am observing that these 3 sets of needs are not incompatible with each other, or with what Baeksean has to offer. That is not a recommendation. That is an analysis." She said, "And what do you need?" He said, and his voice was very quiet, "I need to know you will be all right." She did not speak for a while. The silence was the painful kind, not the productive silence of strategic thought, but the silence of feeling something so large and so irreducibly human that language cannot find its way into the room where it lives. She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while, the general and the woman of Calabar, in the room where they had planned campaigns and argued strategies and mapped futures, and did not say anything at all. He died in the winter of that year. He died as he had lived, quietly, with control, having arranged his affairs with the precision he brought to all his affairs. He left clear instructions about Kanu. He left her a document, a formal one, with the seal of his authority, that established her position as a recognized dignitary of the Eastern Territories with specific protections and specific rights, which was the last strategic act of a man who had spent his life thinking about what structures would outlive him and whether they were strong enough. She stood at his burial in the Eastern Mountains, in the cold, with Kanu Hanul beside her, 7 years old and already possessed of his father's quality of stillness, watching the proceedings with the dark, deep, evaluating eyes she had given him. And she felt grief as a physical architecture, something with mass and weight and structural properties, something that rearranged the space it occupied. She had been prepared for this moment by everything in her life, and it was still unbearable, and both things were equally true. She did not weep publicly. She was too old in the ways of political life for that kind of exposure, and she was also simply not a person who wept publicly. But that night, alone in the room that had been hers for 7 years, she wept privately and without restraint, for a long time, and in the morning she washed her face and returned to the work. Lord Bexian came to offer his formal condolences 3 weeks after the burial. He came alone, without his full retinue, which she noted, it was a gesture of deliberate informality, an indication that he was not approaching her in his official capacity. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered, with the face of someone who has spent much of his life outdoors and the hands of someone who has spent the rest of it working. He was not, as Hanul had said, subtle. He said, after the formal condolences had been delivered, "I hope you will permit me to say that I have admired your work for several years." She said, "I know." General Hanul told me. He looked briefly startled, then, to his credit, amused. He said, "I was not as discreet as I believed." She said, "You are not." But the admiration seemed genuine, which I found I did not mind. He said, "It is entirely genuine. I have not encountered anyone who manages political complexity with your elegance. It is not a quality I find easily in this work." She said, "It is not elegance. It is arithmetic." He said, "Perhaps. But there are many people who know arithmetic and few who make it look the way you make it look." She watched him for a moment. She said, "You know that you are beginning a conversation that will be observed." He said, "I know." She said, "And you know that any serious relationship between us will produce complications for both of us. You are a Korean lord of significant standing. I am a woman of Calabar whose position here is still, despite everything, understood differently by different factions." He said, "I know all of this." She said, "Why then?" He said, "Simply, because the complications are worth it. And because I believe you understand, better than anyone I have met, what this territory needs and what the coming years will require. And because," he paused, and what came into his face was something direct and uncalculated, more effective precisely because of that, and because I have wanted to have this conversation for 2 years, and I am tired of finding reasons not to. She was quiet for a long time. She was performing no calculation, which was unusual for her. Usually thought moved through her at all times like water through a system. But in this moment she was simply present, simply in the room with this man who was not subtle and not extraordinary in the ways she was accustomed to measuring, but who was honest and steady and sufficiently brave to say the direct thing when the direct thing needed saying, which was its own kind of gift. She said, "Then we will continue this conversation. But slowly. There is a great deal that both of us should understand before anything is decided." He said, "I am a patient man." She said, "We will see." What developed between them was different from what had existed between her and Hanul, and she did not try to make it the same thing, which would have been a failure of honesty toward both men. With Hanul there had been equivalence, two minds of the same order meeting and generating, in the contact, something neither could have produced alone. With Baeksean there was something different, a complementarity, the way that different materials are strong together because their strengths run in different directions. He was straightforward where she was intricate. He was physical and immediate where she was analytical and long-range. He felt things in the body first and the mind after. She felt things in the mind first and the body, sometimes not at all until much later when the intellectual processing was complete. They were good together. She had not expected to be surprised by this, and she was. She had understood, when she allowed the relationship to develop, that it was politically sensible and personally reasonable and possibly, in time, more than either of those things. She had not expected it to be, so quickly and so frankly, joyful. The particular joy of being seen by someone who is genuinely looking, not through the lens of what they need from you, but simply, honestly, as you are. Kanu Hanul accepted Baeksean with the careful deliberation of a child who has inherited his mother's intelligence and his father's reserve. He did not yield his loyalty easily, which Aret considered entirely appropriate. What she observed over the course of the first year was that Baeksean understood this, that he was patient and consistent with the boy, not performing affection but demonstrating the more reliable thing, which is simply showing up, being present, not requiring anything in return. They had children together, a girl first, then a boy, both born in the years when the eastern coastal territories were at their most prosperous and most stable, the brief window between the long civil conflict and what was coming. She named the girl Marin, a name from her own tongue that meant the sea in its strongest aspect. She named the boy Aret, threading both their names together in a way that she knew was a declaration, an act of deliberate weaving between two worlds that many people around her still preferred to keep separate. The threat that had been building for 3 years became explicit in the late winter of their 5th year together. Lord Okti was not a figure from the existing political landscape. He had arrived from the northern border regions in the aftermath of the civil conflict, a warlord of tremendous physical force and tactical competence who had built, during the years of the new court stabilization, a military structure of significant size and sophistication. He had also built, in the eastern coastal regions, a network of allegiances through a combination of bribery and intimidation that had been proceeding largely below the level of official notice. She had noticed. She had been tracking him for 18 months before Baeksean's council acknowledged that a problem existed. This was not unusual. She had a wider network of intelligence sources than anyone in the Eastern Territories, built over years of the trade representative work and the diplomatic relationships she had cultivated independently. She brought her analysis to Baeksean with the same directness she brought to everything. She said, "He is going to move against the coastal territories within the year. He needs the port access for the trade revenue, and he is determined that the current arrangement is not going to yield it to him through negotiation." Baeksean said, "You are certain?" She said, "I am certain enough to be preparing." He said, "What does preparation look like?" She said, "It looks like what I have already begun to do. I have been in contact with 3 of the northern lords who have their own grievances against Okti. I have been laying out the terms of a coordination that would, if Okti moved." He looked at her for a moment with the look she had come to know over 5 years, the look that was Baeksean at his most Baeksean, which was the look of a man who is not analytical or subtle or strategic, but who is present, utterly present, in the specific moment of the specific life he is actually living. He said, "I know what I have in you. I want you to know that I know." She said, "I know." He said, "Good." Then he rode north. The weeks that followed were the worst of her life and also, in some ways, the most complete. The weeks in which every skill she had built and every alliance she had cultivated and every piece of intelligence she had gathered were brought to bear simultaneously on a situation that was moving faster than any plan could account for, and in which she made decisions by the hour, some of them good and some of them wrong, and most of them somewhere in the uncertain space between, which is where all real decisions live. The northern lords held. Her two-front assessment was correct. Okti, pressed from the north and meeting stronger resistance in the eastern territories than he had anticipated, began to make the errors that generals make when they are fighting a war that is not proceeding on schedule. He overextended. He divided his forces. He committed his reserves too early. Baekseon saw the opening and took it. The final engagement was at the coast itself, where Okti had tried to force a passage to the sea and found instead that he had driven himself into a position from which retreat was as dangerous as advance. The fighting was fierce and close and lasted 2 days, and Baekseon was in the center of it, as he always was, because he was that kind of man, not a commander who directed from behind, but one who led from within, which was his great strength and also, in the end, his vulnerability. The messenger came on the second morning. She heard his horse before she heard his voice, and she knew from the quality of the speed, urgent but not frantic, not the speed of immediate catastrophe, but the speed of news that needed to arrive, that what was coming was not the worst possible thing, but was still very bad. Baekseon was alive. He was wounded, significantly, in the final hours of the battle, when the last of Okti's forces had broken and the pursuit had become dangerous in the particular way that pursuit always becomes dangerous. The momentum of victory carrying men past the point of tactical sense into the range of a desperate and cornered enemy who had nothing left to lose. He had been struck twice. He was alive. He was being brought to the coast. She went to him. She covered the distance in 3 hours and found him in a farmhouse at the edge of the dunes, attended by his officers and a court physician who was competent and frightened in equal measure. He was conscious, which was better than she had feared. He was pale in a way that had nothing to do with light and everything to do with what the body does when it is engaged in the expensive work of deciding whether to continue. She sat beside him. She took his hand. He looked at her and said, in the voice of someone who is conserving everything, "Did we hold?" She said, "We held. Okti is finished. The northern lords are pressing his retreat. It is over." He said, "The children." She said, "Safe. All of them. They are coming." He was quiet for a while. The room was full of the sounds that a room full of people waiting is full of, the breath and the shift, and the careful not sound of people trying not to add to the weight of the air. Then he said, and his voice was very low, "You are right. About everything." She said, "Not everything. I was wrong about the 3rd week. I thought he would fall back earlier than he did." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, or the beginning of one. He said, "You are correcting yourself at my deathbed." She said, "You are not going to die. I have not given you permission." He said, "I am not sure permission is the mechanism." She said, "It is the mechanism I have available." He held her hand. The light at the window was the iron-gray light of the seacoast, the same light that had been there since she first arrived on this peninsula all those years ago, the metallic blue that she had never found a name for in her own tongue. She looked at it and thought, "I will name it now." In Efik, there is no single word for this light, but she would make one. She would carry it home in the inventory of things she had found in this country that did not exist in any language she had arrived speaking. He did not die that winter. He recovered, slowly and incompletely. His left side was changed by the wound, would always be changed, but he was alive and present and, by the following spring, able to walk to the edge of the water and stand looking out at the sea with Kanuhanul on one side of him and Marin on the other, which was a sight that she committed to her deepest memory with the full attention it deserved. The battle's aftermath was political work of the most intricate kind, and she did it with the patience of someone who understands that the ends of things are often more demanding than their middles. The formal recognition of the eastern coastal territories, the accounting of Okti's networks and the unwinding of his allegiances, the letters to the capital, the new trade agreements, the careful, multi-year process of building the legal and economic structure of the territories on a foundation that would survive the next generation's politics and the generation after that. She also wrote, in this period, the first of what would become a series of documents she sent to Calabar along, detailed accounts of the Korean political and geographic landscape, of the trade possibilities along the eastern sea route, of the cultural and intellectual traditions of the peninsula's scholarly class. She was building a record. She was making it possible for what she had experienced to be understood and used by people who came after her, people of her own blood and lineage and trading network who might follow her route and find, on the other side of the world. Not the incomprehensible, but something they had been briefed to understand. This was the deepest strategy, the one that operated on the longest timescale, the one that most people around her could not see because it was not visible in the actions of any given day. She was not only building a life, she was building a bridge, stone by stone, across the distance between two worlds that had not known each other and that she had decided, with the quiet absolute authority she brought to all her decisions, should. Hanul grew. He was, by the time he was 12, already remarkable in ways that would have been visible to anyone with eyes to see, equally fluent in Hangul and the Efik tongue, with Arabic coming in third and the Chinese scholarly language beginning to yield to him. Possessed of his mother's political intelligence and his father Hanul's tactical precision and something else, something of his own that she could not attribute to either of his parents, which was a quality of warmth, a genuine and encompassing care for the people around him that was not strategic and not performed, but simply present. The way the river was present, the way the tide was present. He would be both things, Kanu, the Great One, and Hanul, the sky. He would be large enough for both. She watched him and felt the old calibrated piece of someone who has accomplished something real. Not the piece of completion, she was not finished. There was no finished. There was only the work and then more work, but the piece of having done the essential thing correctly. She had built something that would outlive her. That was, in the end, all anyone could do. It was enough. It was more than enough. She died at 63, in the room she had lived in for 30 years at the eastern coast. With the iron-gray sea light at the window and the sound of the water at the edge of the dunes and her children and grandchildren around her in the particular configuration of family that she had built out of two worlds and the gap between them, which had turned out not to be an absence, but a space, the space in which something entirely new could grow. She had been ill for several months and had managed the information with her characteristic precision, extending the period of her public activity longer than anyone who knew her medical situation would have considered possible. Because there were things she needed to complete before she permitted herself the luxury of dying. The trade agreement with the new Efik coalition. The document establishing the educational institution she had funded at the coastal capital. The long letter she wrote to Kanu Hanul, alone, in the last clear night she had, which was not a letter of instruction. He did not need instruction. He had absorbed her entire life's intelligence like water absorbing light, but a letter of the other kind. The kind that says, "You were the most extraordinary thing I ever made. Not because of what you will do, but because of what you already are, and I am grateful for every ordinary morning we sat together at the edge of the world." Baeksean had died 2 years before her, quietly, in the way of men whose bodies carry old wounds through a long life, and finally come to the accounting of them. She had been present for that, too, had sat beside him as he had sat beside her in the farmhouse at the coast so many years before, had held his hand with the same steadiness with which he had held everything in his life. He had said, near the end, it was worth it. All of it. She had said, yes. He had said, you don't mean all of it. You mean the parts you believe were worth it. You are still doing arithmetic. She had said, I am always doing arithmetic. But the answer is yes. He had died smiling, which was very him, which was why she had loved him. On her own last morning, she asked for the window to be opened, and the iron-gray light came in, the light she had named, decades ago, in the language of her people with the word she had invented for it, a samka, meaning the light that comes from the direction of the thing you are moving toward. Her granddaughter, Marin's eldest child, who had been sitting with her through the night, asked her what she was looking at. She said, the sea. The girl said, what do you see? She said, everything I came for. And everything I did not know to look for, which was more. The girl was quiet. She was 8 years old and very like her grandmother in the ways that were most essential and most enduring. The dark evaluating eyes, the quality of attention that was not passive but active, the sense of someone who had arrived already listening, already taking in the full inventory of the world around her with the serious and complete attention of a person who understands, at whatever level of consciousness is available to an 8-year-old, that the world is large and that she intends to know it. Aret of Calabar looked at this child and felt, In the last clear moment of her long and extraordinary life, the thing she had felt at the very beginning, the thing that had always been present underneath all the calculation and the strategy and the politics and the grief and the love, the foundational condition of her existence, the thing that had moved her across oceans and into the middle of wars and into the rooms of powerful men and into the arms of men she loved and into the far countries of other languages and other skies. Curiosity. Enormous, insatiable, completely undimmed by time or loss or knowledge, the curiosity of the woman who had always been listening, always been preparing, always been certain that the world contained more than it had yet revealed and that her job, her specific and sacred job, was to go find it. She closed her eyes in the light she had named Asamka, the light from the direction of the thing you are moving toward. She moved toward it. In the records of the eastern coastal territories that survived the following generations, she appears in several forms, as a diplomatic entry, as an architectural note in the documentation of the trade institution she founded, as a name in the bloodline of the coastal nobility, and most often in the margins, in the annotations and the footnotes and the handwritten glosses where the scholars who came after her tried to account for a figure who did not fit neatly into the available categories. The scholars argued, as scholars do, about how to characterize her. Was she a traitor or a diplomat? A political advisor or an independent power? A woman of Calabar who happened to be in Korea or a Korean dignitary who happened to be from Calabar? Did she belong to the history of the peninsula or to the history of the Delta or to some third history that had not yet been given a name? The arguments were interesting and none of them was wrong and none of them was sufficient. She had lived in the gap between categories, which was not a diminishment, but a territory, a real place with its own geography and its own weather and its own particular quality of light, which was the light of being entirely, irrevocably, productively oneself, in whatever country you happened to be standing in, with whatever name the sky happened to be going by that morning. The Eastern Sea was called, in her time and afterward, by a name that appears in the records without clear etymology, a name that the scholars eventually traced to neither Chinese nor Korean nor any of the other linguistic sources of the peninsula, but to a trade tongue phrase that had been in circulation among the merchant networks of the coastal territories for several generations before the first records were made. The phrase was, in the hybrid language of the trade routes, something like, the sea she named. No one knew, by the time the records were written, which sea she had named or when or what she had called it. The name had outlasted its explanation, which is the particular kind of immortality available to those who leave their mark in the language, not in the monuments or the titles or the formal records, but in the living body of the words that people carry without knowing where they came from, that persist because they are useful, because they describe something real that needed describing, because someone, once, paid enough attention to a thing that she found the word for it. And the word was true, the light from the direction of the thing you are moving toward. Asamka.